Last time I was in New York City, I gave a speech and I got dragged out and choked at the end of the speech. So I have low expectations. Hopefully do a little better than last time at the Chinese consul.
Will now talk to us about rescue or terrorism. And how big ag is criminalizing animal care. Thank you very much.
I'm really excited to be here. It's a blast to be in New York City. It's a blast to be around a lot of friendly, familiar faces, but also a lot of new faces too. As Anami suggested, I'm here to talk about rescue or terrorism. And I changed this presentation a little at the last moment because we had some recent news in the DXC network that many of you probably heard of. And I'll talk about that news right now. This is Diane Candice, a good friend of mine in the Bay Area. She is in her 60s, retired, mild-mannered, spends most of her time gardening and volunteering in animal shelters. She's literally never been in trouble in her entire life. She made her bed every single day when she was a kid. This is how well-behaved Diane is as a person. But in the eyes of law enforcement, Diane Candice is a terrorist. As I suggested, Diane is now being accused by law enforcement and animal agriculture to be an eco-terrorist. And this is why. Because she took this dying bird to the vet. This bird, Ella, was at a cage-free Costco farm. And she was on the brink of death. She could barely stand and walk. She was not physically able to lay any more eggs, so she had no economic value to the industry. In fact, she was so physically weak, she was unable to move away as a rain of feces and urine fell on her head from the perches above her. And Diane did what any good person would do if they see an animal suffering in such atrocious conditions. She tried to help, and that's it. She didn't even walk onto the property. She didn't break anything. She didn't cut any locks, break any barbed wire fences. She literally just stood at the border of the property, received a hen who was dying, and took this hen to the vet. That was the extent of her involvement in this rescue. And she was charged for this act of compassion with larceny, criminal mischief, and theft, and alleged by the industry to be an eco-terrorist. So what in God's name is going on here? How did this possibly happen? And could it happen again? Could it happen to one of you for taking care of an animal who's in distress? And maybe most importantly, what can be done? People all over the world, including non-vegans, have been outraged by this story. Yet this story continues to repeat itself over and over again. And too often, especially in today's world, in the face of bad behaving institutions and politicians and law enforcement, we feel powerless to create change. But the talk I'm going to give you today is not about powerlessness. And Diane's story is a happy and powerful one because it shows us that there is something we can do together. The industry attempted to punish Diane for saving a life precisely because they knew that the act of saving a life in a world where so many lives are being terrorized and destroyed is a revolutionary act that holds tremendous power. We hold this power. You hold this power. But to wield that power, we have to understand it. And the power to change the world, I'm going to argue today, comes in three parts. Power in rescue, power in sacrifice, and power in numbers. Let's start at the beginning. Power in rescue. So the quote here is, whoever saves one life saves the world. Has anyone heard this quote before or know where it's from?
Yeah, it's a Jewish quote.
It's often quoted as a citation from the Talmud. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Talmud.
So it's most famous for being in the Jewish tradition. And probably from a media and culture perspective, the most famous instantiation of this quote in the American media is from a film called Schindler's List, and from this scene in particular. So the scene starts with the people of Krakow getting rounded up because the German army has been ordered to shut down the ghetto of Krakow. And a little girl appears in the scene. And this is one of the only instances in the entire film where there's any color. And we know the girl and see the girl and identify with this individual girl because she has a bright red coat in a film that's otherwise entirely black and white. And because she has this quote, we know that someone loved her. Someone gave her this coat, but that someone is now gone. The little girl is wandering around in the streets alone, crying for her parents. The German soldiers move in. There's violence raging all around her. People are being killed, they're being beaten. But through it all of us as viewers can't stop thinking of this one little girl. We think to ourselves, my God, what if that were my little sister, my niece, my daughter? And that's what Oskar Schindler, the protagonist in this movie, thinks too, when he sees the little girl in the bright red coat. He sees her. It shakes him into action, and it shakes us too, because the violence has suddenly become not abstract, not impersonal, but very deep, very personal, and affecting our own family, our own loved ones. Because we want to save this girl. We need to save her. And in our desperation to save this one individual life, we finally understand as viewers and as activists the urgency of saving all the lives. Our second example comes from Christianity. Does anyone know the parable of the Good Samaritan? Is anyone Christian? I'm actually not Christian, so if I get this parable wrong, please do correct me. So it's about a traveler, right? And do you want to describe what happens to the traveler? I'll tell you a little bit more about my own religious tradition in a bit. But as the parable goes, a traveler who's not from the higher classes is walking along the road, and a robber sets upon him. The robber beats this traveler, takes all the things that he has, even his clothes, and leaves him naked and dying on the ground. Shortly after the man is left to die on the ground, a priest, a high-ranking official in the religious tradition in the region, passes by. He sees the man lying on the ground and says, I just don't have time. I'm an important priest. There are more important things for me to do. A government official then passes by and looks at the man and decides, I don't have the resources. I don't have the money. I've got all these things I'm balancing, trying to spend money to help my people. I can't help this individual who's lying on the ground. I'm an important government official. And then finally, a Samaritan, who at the time was one of the most loathed people in his community, of the lower classes, the least social status and prestige, walks by this injured traveler. He stops, he looks at the man, and he says, I need to do something to save this man's life. He dresses the man's wounds, takes him to an inn, and even gives the innkeeper some money to ensure this man's life is saved. And he saves that traveler's life. True, it's just one life, and true, the priests and the officials probably did have important things to do for their community. But in saving this one man's life, the Good Samaritan has showed us how to save the world, because his story has now become one of the most important moral parables in the history of human civilization. Now let's move from the east to the west, or from the west to the east, I'm sorry. This is my family's history. Like so many in Asia, we're steeped in the Buddhist tradition. Compassion for anyone who suffers, human or non-human, is central to our tradition and part of our moral duty to the world and the universe. And this is a powerful example of just that. A Buddhist monk sees a sick homeless man. The sick man can barely even hold his head up. If he doesn't get treatment soon, he'll probably die. Thousands of people pass by this man in a train station. Many of them look with horror and disgust. The ones who are a little bit more moral have pity on this man and say, I don't want to touch him. He could be diseased. He could be deadly. He could be dangerous. So some of them may leave a couple dollars, but this man is sick and he's about to die. And the only one who stops is a Buddhist monk. And the Buddhist monk not only stops, but he takes the man's hand. He offers to take him to the doctor, to give him aid. And everyone around him watches, stunned. Because by saving this one man's life, the monk has shaken the masses. He's part of a movement to save the world. This is the calling of every Buddhist, including the Buddhists in my family, to help those in need, to live our lives with nonviolence, and to let compassion, not violence and hatred and oppression, be our mantra. But there's one class of beings that Buddhists have been especially called to save, and that is animals. Because in the Buddhist tradition, the more vulnerable the victim, the more compelling our duty to offer aid. And the animals are in a state of powerlessness in the face of their human tormentors. We steal their children away. We burn down their homes. We even take their bodies, the only thing they're left with, the only things they have after years of torment and captivity, and we literally consume their bodies. We erase them from this earth and force them to become part of us by ingesting them. In such a world, saving the life of even one animal is a revolutionary act. A little known to most of us in the West, Buddhists are at the forefront of this revolution. The practice you're seeing here in this slide is called life release, or in Chinese, it's called 放生. And it literally means saving a life, releasing a life from captivity. And the idea behind it is simple. Take an animal who's destined to die, save them and care for them, then give them the freedom they've been denied for their entire life. By doing so, not only do we as Buddhists believe we save the animal, we believe we save ourselves by bringing purpose and karma to our lives. But most important, we believe we are contributing to saving the entire world. Because Buddhists believe that the karmic tremors from one revolutionary act of compassion cascade and tremor across the entire earth in a wave of compassion and nonviolence. And in fact, the practice of Hsiung is numerically already the greatest liberation movement, numerically, in the history of human civilization. 200 million animals were released in Hsiung just last year across all of Asia. So at DXC, we've learned from these great cultural traditions, and we have one and only one mission: to rescue animals, no matter what it takes, to save life rather than take it, as tradition in all these great moral cultures and moral traditions has taught us to do. And by doing so, by saving this one life, to save the entire world. But this is not just a good story and a good parable. It has a strategy behind it, a social science behind it, a pragmatism to it. And to understand why it's strategic and not just ethical to save individual lives, we have to understand the nature of the problem we face as animal rights activists and environmentalists. So how many of you have had the following experience? You talk to a friend, show them some footage, and they're just outraged. They say, someone's got to make this stop. Has anyone had this experience? Okay. Most of the people know. Now, how many have also had the experience, sometimes with the same friend, of talking to your friend about veganism and having them say, don't tell me what to do. That's my choice. Okay. Many people raise their hands, in fact, many of the same people. And many of you have probably had exactly that same experience with exactly the same person, which seems completely contradictory, because on the one hand, they're watching the footage and saying, tell that person to stop. And then when you say, well, but why don't we stop contributing to it? They say, don't tell me what to do. So if we care about animal suffering, how do we reconcile these two contrary intuitions that so many people have? When people eat animals, they say that we shouldn't mess with their choices. When they see animals being tortured, they say we have to mess with people's choices and stop them from violence against animals. And I think the answer to this question is that when people eat animals and contribute to these big and broader economic, political, and moral systems of violence, they're not really making an intelligible choice. Instead, their choice is a product of a system. And that system is called speciesism. I define speciesism as the ideology of human domination over other animals. And it is a system that conditions our behavior and beliefs in ways that we don't even appreciate from the very day that we're born. Anytime someone, especially an adult human being, treats another animal with compassion, for example, by trying to encourage others to stop violence against animals, they're told their action is ridiculous, or too extreme, or too sentimental. And anytime someone treats an animal as a mere thing, as property to be dominated by using an animal, by ingesting an animal, by exploiting an animal, they're told that it's normal, it's appropriate, it's ethical behavior. And in this way, the system of speciesism sustains itself by constantly reinforcing behavior that's consistent with the domination over other animals and challenging and repressing any act of compassion that dissents against this ideology. But this is a system, and it is a system, not an individual choice. But it's a system that's not actually based on any logic, any facts, or frankly, even on intelligible and autonomous choices. Let me explain. Consider the logic behind speciesism. Does anyone know who these two people are by chance? Peter Singer? Nozick, you got it. Jay knows. So anyone who knows these two people probably knows that on most issues, they're pretty much as far apart from each other as you could possibly get. Robert Nozick is probably the most famous libertarian philosopher, certainly of the past 100 years, maybe of all time. And he believes fiercely that people should have the right to do basically whatever they want, and redistribution is wrong. Peter Singer, on the other hand, is perhaps the most prominent and famous proponent of redistribution, that we have to give to the poor, that governments should redistribute wealth from the wealthy to the poor. But there is one, and only one thing, that Peter Singer and Robert Nozick actually agreed on. Any guesses as to what this might be? Killing animals. So even Robert Nozick, a libertarian who otherwise thought there should be no constraints on human liberty, believed that killing animals was wrong because you're impinging on someone else's liberty. It's inconsistent. It's a crime to eat a dog in this country, and in fact, everybody agrees with this. It's a felony in virtually every state of this nation to kill a dog, to eat the dog. And yet it's just breakfast to eat an equally sentient and conscious animal like a pig. How can these morally equivalent actions be treated so differently from a philosophical, from a moral, from a political and legal perspective? It makes no sense. And in fact, the experts in our world have actually been surveyed on the issue of killing animals for food, and guess what? 60% of them That's 60, not 16. 60% of them, the vast majority of them, say that eating animals is, quote, morally bad. So speciesism is not based on sound logic. Even a 5-year-old can understand there's no difference between a pig and a dog, and the greatest experts in the world when it comes to moral philosophy, including both Robert Nozick on the right and Peter Hsiung on the left, agree that killing animals is wrong. So speciesism is not based on logic, it's an ideology that's forced on us despite its lack of logic. Speciesism is also not based on fact. Anyone know who this guy is by chance?
Tolstoy?
Charles Darwin, great, yeah. And Darwin is most famous for proposing and verifying the theory of evolution, but he also believed that evolution had normative implications, had moral implications. He believed that humankind was not at the end or at the top of some evolutionary ladder or chain, but rather life on this planet was a web, that we're all part of the same creation. And the ability to feel, to think, to love, to care, to fight, to suffer, that all of us on this earth are equals. And Darwin is not alone. Thousands of evolutionary biologists, neuroscientists, cognitive scientists gathered across the country and across the world and recently announced in a consensus at Cambridge that we can say with utmost confidence that animals are in fact conscious in the same way that human beings are. So speciesism, the denial of animal consciousness, the denial of animal suffering, is not even based on sound facts or science. It's an ideology. But most surprisingly, speciesism is not even based on individual choice. Consider the following story. This story went viral in the Huffington Post a few months ago. And it's a story of Libby and Pearl. And Libby is the little girl on the left, and Pearl is the little girl on the right. And Libby, from an early age, she's I think 2 or 3 years old in this image, fell in love with pigs. She loved pigs. And so her parents decided they'd adopt a pig. And they're now inseparable. They sleep together, they play together, they even share food together. They're best friends. But Libby, this 2-year-old child, is not alone. After all, what 2-year-old child, if they are given an apple and a piglet, will decide to kill and eat the piglet and play with the apple? Very few children would do that. Who among us would do that, in fact? Yet that's what we all eventually do. How does this happen? What changes for little girls like Libby so that the compassion is suppressed and replaced with speciesism? Well, what changes is there's a system that socializes them, that teaches them every day that despite the love that you have for animals, despite the fact that when you meet a little piglet, this adorable, beloved animal, you don't think, oh, I think I should just kill this animal and throw them in my mouth. It never even occurs to young children. But it's socialization that over time batters people's compassion down, makes people think that animals are things, despite the fact that all their intuitions and experiences suggest otherwise. And the few people who manage to sustain themselves and sustain their compassion despite their socialization as children are laughed at, decried, and assaulted and insulted as overly sentimental or extreme. In this fashion, our individual choices from our earliest childhood experiences are taken away from us. Speciesism is not even a choice, yet it's a dominant ideology of the day. So what can be done? We don't have to wonder how to change systems because we can look at the best evidence from scholars and activists throughout history to assess how we can change systems and move away from just trying to change individuals one-to-one to changing the ecosystem, the infrastructure, the ideologies that shape all of our individual beliefs and behaviors. And what scholars have found and activists have found is that there are 3 things that movements must do in order to create change. They must be disruptive, they must be scalable, and they must move people to action, not just passive support, but action. So let's talk about all 3 in the context of rescue and saving a life. Disruption. So you've probably all heard the quote, be the change you want to see in the world. And it's most famously associated with Mahatma Gandhi, although apparently it was not actually a quote from Gandhi. But the idea behind it is quite simple, that if we want to change the world, we have to model the change we want to see in our own behavior. What people don't realize is most of the proponents of the be the change philosophy did not believe that modeling the behavior that we want to see in the world was a matter of just passive support. It's not just saying that Black Lives Matter or saying that we should do something about climate. It's actually doing it. Right? This is an active philosophy, be the change. Don't support the change, but be the change you want to see in the world. In fact, social movement scholars call disruption an intervention that disrupts the paradigm, the pattern, the ideology under which everyone else is living under as the strongest weapon of social movements because it brings oppressive systems like speciesism to a grinding halt. It stops the gears, the mechanics through which people are socialized and indoctrinated into thinking living, breathing, sentient creatures are just things. The act of rescue, of saving lives, is a physical, a symbolic, and a moral disruption of speciesism because it gives the lives of animals the respect that they have always deserved. and it physically stops the act of violence against this animal and takes that animal to sanctuary. Second is scale. Effective movements need to scale. They need to spread far and wide and create change, not just in one individual, but another individual, another individual, another individual. They need to create domino effects that cascade around the world. And every great movement in history, whether it's the civil rights movement in the 1960s, the women's suffrage movement at the turn of the 20th century, or any movement through history that has effectively created change and changed in particular the systems in which we all live, has had scalable effect, has created domino effects. But again, we can look at social science to understand what creates scale. And there are two attributes of effective movements that create scale, that make stories and activism spread far and wide. And those two things are storytelling and active emotions. So we probably all have had an experience of watching a really good movie, or even having a personal experience with a really good story. If you have a really good story, it's like irrepressible. You have to share it with everyone, right? Like your favorite movie. You probably shared your favorite movie with at least 10 people, you know? If you have a comic book you really liked, I was a big fan of comic books, even though my parents wouldn't buy them for me when I was a kid. And when I read a really good comic book, I just had to share it with everyone. So this is an attribute of human sociality. We communicate with each other. We learn from each other. We teach each other through storytelling. In fact, many cognitive scientists and linguists think storytelling might be the reason human beings invented language, so we could share stories with each other and learn from each other through them. Well, the animal rights movement needs to tell stories too. And the power of open rescue is the power of storytelling. Instead of having an abstract philosophical argument, we have a plot, we have characters, we have drama, we have tension, we have villains, we have heroes, right? All the things that go into a good story go into open rescue, and I'll show you an open rescue that has a good story in just a moment. But we also have powerful emotions. And in fact, social scientists have studied what sort of messaging actually creates scalable change, what sort of messaging goes viral. And it's messaging that has powerful emotional impacts. It's not just about reason. It's not just about sound argument, as important as sound arguments are. It's about creating active emotions like hope, inspiration, anger even, that drive people to act and share their stories with the world. Open Rescue achieves this as well by telling inspiring stories of animals who are taken from abusive situations and rescued and brought to sanctuary. We generate emotions in people that impel them and compel them to go out and share those stories with more people. And then finally, we have to move people. So effective movements don't just have statistics. They create moving narratives that focus on individuals. And there's actually a term for this in social psychology. It's called the identifiable victim effect. So you probably all heard the quote that 1 million deaths is just a statistic, but 1 life lost is a tragedy. And one of the reasons all the great cultural traditions that I mentioned at the start of this talk focus on the act of saving an individual life is that human cognition works best and human empathy works best when we focus on a particular individual. So many of you have probably had the experience of having a conversation with one person and having a really powerful bond as a result of that conversation. You sit down, you focus your attention on them, you learn their story, you feel their feelings, you have a grasp of who it is, what it's like to be this person in a way that you don't when you're in a group of even 3 people. So would everyone agree with this? Like when you're in a group of people, it's just different than sitting down one-to-one. Well, the same is true of activism and narrative. And one of the reasons, some of the most important points in the history of social justice, whether it's the death of Eric Garner at the hands of police, whether it's Rosa Parks in the civil rights movement, Emmeline Pankhurst being dragged off from Parliament after she protested the lack of women's suffrage in the United Kingdom. These individual stories are powerful because when there's an individual that people can focus their attention on, it generates empathy and moves people to change. In fact, fascinating social scientific research shows that even when you add one other victim, so when you move from 1 victim to 2, people's compassion immediately starts burning out because they just can't grapple with 2 people. It's like trying to have a conversation with 2 people. It's hard, right? But similarly, it's hard to have compassion for 2 people. So the best way for us to compel people and move people to change the world is actually to focus on individual stories and lives. And again, Open Rescue takes advantage of this. By narrowing down the problem of animal abuse and systemic animal agriculture that is on the scale of billions and even trillions down to one individual life, we compel and inspire in people powerful emotions that will cause them to act and change. And now I'm going to show you an example of this. So I'm going to warn you ahead of time that DXC tries to avoid the most graphic imagery, but in all the videos we create, there are scenes where animals are in distress and sadness. So if anyone feels they might be triggered by this, I just want to give you a moment to step outside, close your eyes, or prepare yourselves. This is definitely not one of our worst videos, but it's a story of a chicken who's rescued from distress. I will tell you it has a happy ending, so if that's helpful. So if anyone wants to step out, please feel free to do so. It's just going to be 2 minutes. So we're going to move very slowly through here, and we're going to have to make way for ourselves. So in Scarlett's miraculous transformation, we can see a transformation in our entire world. But this is not just a good parable and a good story. Again, it's a strategy for social change.